There we go. Yeah, no, welcome. I'm excited to be here, and I'm very excited to be going to the Shingo conference in a few weeks and bringing in some 80s themes to my keynote. So, and as you know from reading the book, Mr. Yoshino was in Orlando for many years during the big, during a big part of his end of his career. So it's a nice sort of link there in the stories in the event.
That is incredible. Yeah. So for a second, I thought you're going to say that Mr. Yoshino is going to join us in Orlando.
No, unfortunately, he hasn't been able to travel ever since the pandemic. And he, as a real international person, it's been hard for him. But he loves now host. He just turned 80 in January, and he's doing well. But I'm hoping he can travel again. But we'll see. He loves now being part of my Japan study trips and getting to interact with international people that way as well.
Thank you, Katie. So obviously, again, congratulations on such a great book on being awarded the Shingo Award publications and research. And it's filled with insights from yourself and from Mr. Yoshino-san. Clearly, a lot of research and deliberations has gone into this. Now, you use this very interesting analogy of warp and weft, which is there throughout the book. Can you tell us a bit more and how you think leaders can use this analogy to develop the people?
Sure. So when I was writing the book, it was sort of this culmination of my previous first career as an academic researcher doing qualitative research, all interview-based, in my master's degree in that way. And then, my passion for lean and continuous improvement and leadership all coming together. And when Mr. Yoshino and I decided to partner together to do a book, we knew I would be writing it, but we thought it would be more of this bringing in my stories too and shared collaboration. But as I was doing more and more interviews, just the richness and the depth and the breadth of stories and experiences over 40 years at Toyota, it became really clear to me that I wanted to honor that first. But I was stuck in terms of thinking about how to write about his personal life and then write about the professional life as well. And so I was, the writing process, as you know, from creating a book it's a messy one. There's a lot of just figuring things out and going as you go. And I kept saying to him, there seem to be two threads of purpose that run through your life. One about moving to the United States, learning English. It's just like guided everything in your life. And then there's this other part of you that's just about learning and helping people learn and growing into leaders and being their best person ever. And he said, oh, that's really interesting. You're seeing that. We actually have this metaphor in Japan about kimono weavers. And this is where the warp and weft came from. He said, the kimono weavers, the warp threads, which come from the loom. So actually these threads here, the threads that are laid down, the vertical threads on a loom that are firm and constant, represent the kimono weavers' intention, their drive, their vision for what they're going to create, sort of the known part in the beginning. And then the weft threads, which are the ones that are interwoven and are discovered and incorporated, and maybe those are the ones that break and they're a little more fluid. And I did some research and realized discovered this actually is a metaphor around purpose. And I had this aha moment that's how I could actually weave the stories of the book. And it also was a nice connection back to Toyota's history, being the Toyota automatic loom work. So it just sort of all literally tied together. So I used the warp threads, which were the constant threads of Mr. Yoshino's life, which was this deep desire to go overseas and connect with other people that way. And then the weft threads were all of his leadership learning stories at Toyota. And I teach this a lot with organizations when I go in and talk about the book or talk about leadership concepts and how people can bring all of these things into their practice. And we go through this exploration of first drawing your purpose and then really figuring out what are the things that are known to you. If maybe you weren't aware of them, but really, if you think back, have always been constant and part of driving your decision-making through your life. And then what are the things that you have discovered through experience, both successes and failures and different things that you've incorporated in that intersection then becomes really your purpose in your personal life tapestry. And it continues to evolve. Like we continue to discover things through our life journey, our professional journey. And it just helps get, weaves a different pattern based on those experiences as well. And people, really connect with this idea around purpose because a lot of times we're not asked like, what's our purpose? Oh, what is our purpose? Like we kind of have this, like maybe this idea here, but really having to draw it and then articulate it can be very powerful and reconnect us with that sense of heart of why we're in a leadership role or why we're in whatever role we're in. It's not just the title, but there's something greater that we're trying to accomplish and do and leave that legacy.
Oh, that's incredible. Do you think leaders can use that way of thinking, um, that purpose, that sense of purpose, the work, if you like, to lead their own people? After all, isn't leadership exactly that, to develop the people around you, like Mr. Yoshino-san has done in his lifetime?
Absolutely. And so what I experience, and this was for me as personally as well, that if we can reconnect with that purpose of that's really what we want and the type of leadership we want to be, and then what gets in our way. So this Japanese word on the back of my wall here, it's actually the same word. It's intention in Japanese and the kanji. And the first part of it represents the spirit of your heart. So like what's important, your purpose inside, and then what actions do you need to take that align in that direction? So the lower one is compass for direction. And what I see is this, we have that purpose, but maybe either we've lost sight of it or just get so focused on all the doing and all the outcomes we need that we're just not we're not able to show up that way. And so it's like, how do we reconnect purpose and then align our actions and how we're showing up? And that really is connected to the Shingo model as well, deeply. The ideal behaviors drive the ideal results, but the behaviors sometimes we like lose sight of that because of all the focus on the doing and the results. So it's like we have it backwards. Um, if we can do the behaviors, we'll get the results. But if we're just focused on the results, we may not actually be doing the behaviors that will get us there. So it's sort of this counterintuitive thing, but if we can connect with that purpose, it helps us stay more grounded in those behaviors that then we know are more aligned with developing people and doing all the things that we all know are critical to creating this high performing organization.
I guess I'm curious. It's there in the book, clearly is, but it's worth always asking you: do you think Yoshino-san himself he had a strong sense of purpose? Because throughout his life story that you've told us so beautifully, it's clear that sometimes life is tough. He's been in very difficult situations, hasn't he? Even in one very interesting story that stood out for me, it's as if Toyota is trying to rehabilitate him. Your words, not mine.
Yeah.
Even in that situation, he's going back to his sense of purpose. Can you tell us a bit more, Katie?
Well, it sounds like there were two questions in there. The first was, does Mr. Yoshino have a sense of purpose, or did he have a sense of purpose? Uh, I mean, well, certainly he does have a sense of purpose now, or a clearly articulated purpose. Whether or not that was fully clearly expressed for him back when he was in his 30s, probably not. In the same way that most of us maybe haven't had someone saying, "What is your purpose?" But it was clearly inside of him the way he was showing up, even when he was a young man, of creating an English study group so that people were, frontline managers could be learning English because maybe they didn't have the opportunity for schooling that he had. So always this deep, driving desire to help people learn and become better. And so that really carried through, even if I don't know if it was clearly articulated for himself even, but it manifested in all of his behaviors. And it was interesting that, so I think you're referring to when so Mr. Yoshino went to California, near where I live here, for the NUMMI plant, which was the joint venture between General Motors and Toyota, which is really a famous case study. You can learn a lot about it. Of course, I have stories in the book too. That really was this incredible turnaround from GM's worst performing plant to the best performing plant because of incorporating the Toyota way and Toyota's management practices. And he had he had a lot of realizations when he was living in the United States, and when he got reassigned back in Japan. Part of when Japanese expatriates were like going back to the US, they did want to rehabilitate them, kind of knock out a little bit of the Americanisms that had happened. Because, our culture is very different, especially back in the 80s and 90s. There's a lot more individualism, and Japanese culture is a lot more about being conformist and conforming. And so he even experienced, he's the one who said they probably wanted to rehabilitate me and sort of knock out some of this American stuff. But it was really important for him to also, he thought it was really, he wanted to talk or tell his new employees. So he was in his mid 40s at this time. And he was getting assigned to a new group that he'd never worked with before, and talked to him about articulating his leadership purpose or his leadership motto or the things that were important to him. And so he wrote by hand these 10 principles of Mr. Yoshino as a manager and faxed them over. And it was a few years into my relationship with Mr. Yoshino where I was in his office in Nagoya, and he's like, "Look what I found." He like found the paper, and then he translated it for me. And that's when he started talking about this 10-month experience of being a manager in the Nagoya office. And I know there's some great stories in there that you want to talk about, but articulating his leadership style and what was important to him was part of articulating his purpose and the culture he wanted to develop, so that they really had a sense of who he was before he arrived, and then also held him true. And I actually ask leaders all the time to say, like, write your leadership credo. That's what I call it. Like the aims or beliefs that guide your who you are as a person or who you are as a leader. It doesn't have to be perfect, and it doesn't have to be 10 points, but then start sharing it and use that as a way for making the behaviors you want to be exhibiting in yourself and others visible across your teams and the people you work with as well. And so it's just really cool. Cool, bringing in the 80s words. Really, just amazing. That whole 10 months, and we can talk more about it, is really amazing. And even John Shook, who was a direct report with Mr. Yoshino's back in the early 1980s, when he read the early chapters of the book, he's like, "Oh my gosh," he sort of knew about this time, but not fully. And he said that 10 months for Mr. Yoshino was really like the embodiment of like the ideal version of of what a Toyota leader is about, truly focusing on setting that direction and then developing people and in fostering their best selves in some very creative ways too. And really not being hands off, but being there as a support rather than being there as the driver. So it's a really cool story.
That is incredible. In fact, maybe if we dwell on it for a second, Katie, two questions. The 10 points, when I read it, you almost fall off your chair because it's almost a different way of saying the same 10 guiding principles that the Shingo Institute teaches us, the timeless principles, if you like, of Shingo. And then and then I'm now hearing that you do tell leaders, go and write your own credo. Tell us more, please.
Yeah, well, so so in the book, if you have it, it's on page 203. And when he went and looked back at when we were talking about him, he's like, "Oh, these still work." But that's the point. They are timeless principles. They don't really change. How they manifest and show up maybe are different. And so the principles should guide our actions, and principle based, his last one is maybe not always like in the Shingo model, but his spirits too, like stay cheerful, particularly when you're in trouble. But that's, speaks about this positive attitude. And he'd gone through some challenging experiences the 4 years before then. Yeah, they are timeless, and they're not always exact. I also share like Mr. Nomoto, who was another big leader at Toyota in the 1970s, and actually was sort of a counterpoint to Taiichi Ono in his management style, and was really part of how Toyota was creating its management model. And that was what Mr. Yoshino was part of as well. In a book that he published in the 1980s, he has his 10 points as well of Mr. Nomoto as a manager. And I have those listed on my website too, so you can go check that out. But they're, again, they're not exactly the same as Mr. Yoshino's, but they too speak very much to those guiding principles. They very much align with the Shingo model because it all is speaking to the same thing, the essence of what we need to be doing and guiding us, and then the behaviors that flow from that. You had a second
Amazing.
part of your question in there,
I do. I was going to just remind you, because I think you just told us that you tell leaders now to go and write your own 5 points
yeah.
or 10 points. So, please tell us more. Do you find that helpful? Leaders need to articulate that and communicate that?
So yeah, so regardless, in a lot of the workshops, I've been going around the world the last year and teaching a lot of workshops, building on some concepts of what I was doing before and then out of the book as well. But one of the exercises I have is for people to start drafting their leadership credo, and you can revise it because they draft it and they share it. And you'll see there is a lot of alignment there in what people say because it makes sense. It's all from the principles, but maybe how they articulate it is a little bit different. Yes, I've been doing this for over almost 4 years now since the book came out with leaders, and they say that's one of the most powerful experiences they've had in our coaching or in our work together because it's making visible the things that they believe, and it's a way of there's a sort of multi-purpose. One, you have to articulate what are those behaviors. Two, it holds you true to them, right? Even though you may not be perfect and may not always, it's like the aspiration of how you want to be. And three, you share it with your teams, and that lets them know how are you wanting to show up, but also models the way for what are the ways that they could be showing up and what they want to be doing. And people give me feedback that it's been a really powerful process for talking about leadership and culture and behaviors together. So I encourage all of you, take a pen and paper and don't worry about if it's 10 points or not, but start writing down what are like the key behaviors or principles that are really important to you as a leader, or regardless if you're in an official leadership role, or you're in a role called coach, or you're a team member. What those no more than 10 principles though, because it gets too many things that are really important to you, and then start sharing it. And I'll put a link in, or later we can drop it. But if you Google leadership credo and my name, I have a whole blog post that talks about how to do this and gives some of those examples of Mr. Yoshino's and Mr. Nemoto's leadership credos as well. So it's a great exercise.
So I think if I articulate some of the things you just told us, you suggesting that's a strong way of connecting back with your people and letting them hold you honest as a leader. So write down your credo, if you like. And obviously, Yoshino-san took a leaf out of Mr. Nemoto's book of the 10 principles at the time, and then he came out with the 10. And if I just read a couple of them very quickly, for our very learned audience here, just in case you've forgotten, there, like Yoshino-san said, take a long-term perspective and have foresight. Well, for me, that's constancy of purpose out of the 10 guiding principles. Look at your own job from a company-wide view. Well, isn't that systems thinking? and obviously, always carry a questioning mind and sense of curiosity. Well, there is a big overlap with seeking perfection, of course, and so on and so forth. I just read the first three, by the way, and the rest of them are pretty much the same. So, of course, these are timeless principles, and you just reminded us that good leaders have this sense of purpose, and a big part of that is to develop other people around them, to give back to the communities, to give back to the world, if you like. So it's been great reading your book and now talking to you. We come across a lot of leaders, and I'm sure you do as well, Katie, that after all of this storytelling, the great storytelling that you've done in your book, and of course storytelling is how you build cultures. Of course, human cultures depend on storytelling for a long time, for millennia. After all of this, they still look back and they tell you, well, yes, that's a nice story, that happened in Japan, that happened in Toyota in California in 80s and 90s, but we cannot do it in my organization. That doesn't work. I'm sure you come across that every day. Yes. How do you respond to that?
So, again, it goes back to me that the principles, and like I came from healthcare. So like it's so easy for, I mean, like I didn't come from Japan. I didn't come from manufacturing. I started learning and practicing all of this in healthcare and hospital systems. So first I lead with that, like it is possible to do this. And second, if we just strip away all of the words about lean and all this stuff and get back to the principles, it makes so much sense. So, one of the things I ask people, like, think about a great leader or coach in your life. What did they do? What did they do? And then all those things, it's those exact things. They challenged me. They were there. They guided me. They helped me see more than I could. They were, like, well, okay, so we know this. We know it. It's good leadership. It's good practices. And it is possible. And then it's about how do we challenge our mind, applying some of maybe the production principles to improve processes as well. But it we often as humans like to say, oh, we can't do it here. But I say how it's going to look in your environment might differ. It's not about copying exactly how these principles manifest itself in any one organization or industry, but it's about how do you use these principles to challenge yourself to be getting better and achieve the goals and results that you need in your organization. And so what does that look like for you? So let's not try and be other organizations, but let's try and use those principles to guide what you need to do here. And let's start experimenting. Um, you know, so let's start with something small, right? And what are the problems you're facing, and let's start working there.
Amazing. You have a ton of experience outside the book, of course, so that is not in the book. That's what I mean. Would you be able to share an example of maybe a leader who said initially, well, that story doesn't work here, and then you told them exactly the same thing you just told us, and maybe you helped them see it differently?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm pausing because that's a good question. So I want to go back first to the concept of stories. And so, I ask people to say, like, well, what did you learn from the story? What was Mr. Yoshino's experience in his environment? How does this relate? So a lot of the reflection questions I have at the end of every chapter is like, so how does this relate to you? And through that, people answer that question for themselves, like, oh, what does this make you think about your own organization or the things that you need to do? And so the more you can flip it, and not trying to like force people to see something, but like have those important reflection questions, like, well, how would this work for you? What does it make you think of? What's different? And so getting people to articulate that for themselves is more powerful than me saying, I know this can work. So really asking those powerful questions and as having reflection for others as well. I tend to work now with leaders at least have some interest in making improvement. I think if you have people who are totally resistant for whatever reason, or like this is not going to work here, that you have to have a different approach to those people too, and bring them along on a journey and help them understand, articulate for themselves, like what's the benefit, what are the barriers, and strip away all the things you have to do, but like getting back to what are the things get in your way, and let's talk about that, or what are the challenges, because resistance or putting the barriers up, if there's something coming, there's fear or past experience or something that's coming from here, so we have to address that first before we can move forward.
Katie, I'm hearing that you're saying a very good way to go over this resistance is Hansei, this reflection. Of course, reflection is there in the book everywhere. At the
Mm,
end of each chapter, you allow us to do Hansei and reflect back. And
mm.
um, um, do you find generally that as a very important leadership trait? And what's stopping us from doing that? Is it like the urgency of the moment? Is it like, oh, my KPIs? What's stopping us as leaders, if you like?
So first, to address your first question around the importance of Hansei, or this Japanese word meaning reflection or self-reflection, it is such a powerful and important part, of the learning process. And actually, reflection is where learning happens, and then where wisdom is created. So, if we don't reflect, and that's like the check adjust or the study adjust part of the PDSA cycle, it is that reflection. Otherwise we're stuck in plan, do, plan, do, plan, do, and we're not learning, we're just continuing to throw darts. And The Japanese culture does have a stronger cultural practice of hansei, of reflection, self-reflection that is ingrained. Now, it doesn't mean every Japanese person is great at it, but it is more ingrained. And at Toyota, at least, Mr. Yoshino says it is built into the process. So, clear times for doing that check. The check is not just check the box, but hansei, like studying, which is why I like the word study more than check, because I think in the West we tend to be like, oh, I checked the box. Did we do it or not? But like hansei is much, much richer and deeper on that. Yeah, and what gets in the way is, again, back to we are a culture across, in the West, across the board, focused on results and doing and doing and doing and like plan, do, plan, do, plan, do, because doing feels productive. We're moving, we're doing, we're taking action, but we're not necessarily being smart about what we're doing. So we're not checking and adjusting, or maybe we do it at the very, very end of a long initiative, but we're not building in those like rapid check adjust cycles. And that's really that engine of continuous improvement is doing the reflection and the adjustments on a much smaller basis, not just waiting until the result. And one of the things Mr. Yoshino says, and I opened the book with, that the only secret to Toyota is its attitude towards learning. And part of that is the attitude towards learning is having a really deep practice of hansei. Learning comes from the reflection. So of the hansei, of the is what we thought was going to happen actually happening? What are we reflecting? What are we learning? That was the whole engine of their success is built around that. And we cut it out. I mean, it happens for all of us. It happens for me. Like, you find your calendar all of a sudden shrunk up. Oh, I thought I had some reflection time or some thinking time. And all of a sudden it's filled with meetings and things to do and productivity. But we're not necessarily learning and being effective. So I challenge you to think about how can you carve out even 5 minutes for some reflection and doing that more effectively, and like starting small. And it doesn't always have to be something big, but the reflection is where the improvement's going to happen.
Do you teach leaders that you work with as part of the lead standard work or whatever they call it to build that into the routines, the routine of having reflection time, Katie? And would you like to tell us more about it?
Well, absolutely. I mean, so regardless of what tool or structure you use to help support your practice, and interesting like side note, people often ask Mr. Yoshino, "What does your leader standard work look like?" And he's like, "I have no idea what you're talking about." That is not a tool that they used at Toyota because they didn't need that tool to support their practices, right? We need that tool because it's a new process for us. It's not inherently ingrained in what we're doing. So, again, the tools support the practice, the structures support the practice so that we can have the ideal behaviors that drive the results that we need. Yes, but like build into your practice, either if you use a process like a tool like leader standard work, build in that reflection time. Make sure that it's not just the doing, but there's like something that triggers some reflection at the end of days or at the end of the week or whatever it is to help support you in making sure that happens. And then also, if you weren't able to do it, why not? When I was in the last internal role that I had in the healthcare system, we were really doing that with our leaders to build it, to help them slow down and create that space for the reflection. And they would put that up on either their leader standard worksheet, or some of them had boards and then cards that they used to support that practice. So yes, use the tools that help support you to build in the habits that are really going to be aligned with the results that you want.
Incredible. And some big words of wisdom there in terms of the tools don't matter, the principles do, the practice does. And of course, it's very often, for a long time, I didn't even notice it that the teaching is being reduced to a tool. And then therefore the wisdom behind it sometimes is being lost as a result of that. So thank you for mentioning it, Katie.
I think that's the same with many tools. There's a purpose behind it, and tools are great. Like, I don't want to say that we don't need tools. We need tools to do the work.
Yeah.
We need the right tool to do the work that we need to do and to support the things that we need. But if you're just applying a tool without the purpose behind it, then that's where we go wrong. And I think that was a lot of things. It's easy to take all the artifacts and all the tools and all the processes and woo, like let's just do them, but without that fundamental attitude towards learning and the reason behind it, then that's where we see a lot of failure and a lot of bad experiences with bringing in continuous improvement or Kaizen or lean or whatever you want to call it.
To the point that sometimes, in fact, most of my experience until very recently that I moved to the US is in Europe, we have big organizations, big name government organizations, private sector organizations that the word lean has been banned in because they reduced it to tools and it upset people and there's allergic reaction almost to it, Katie.
Same with a
And
lot of my
therefore we say,
clients.
oh, lean, don't use the word. Well, of course, but the practice, the principles behind it matter.
Yep. I mean, the way I think it's important to meet people and
I've
organizations.
lost you.
You've lost
I
me?
don't know if everyone else. Elsa,
Can others
can
hear
you
me?
hear Katie? You can't hear Katie.
Can you hear me? Okay.
I
You
can hear
can. So
Katie.
it's my
Okay.
end. So please
Okay.
bear with me.
Well,
Carry on,
I'll
please.
speak. Well, let me figure that. Like, it's important to meet people where they're at, right? And so if it's an organization, it's like we want to do lean and bring this in, great. Then I can use all the words and all the all of that align with what they're wanting. But if they're wanting to make improvements or inspire their leaders and be more equipped to like break the telling habit and show up more coach-like and do all these things that we know are actually part of lean, but I won't use any of the the Japanese words or the lean words because it's all still the same thing. And sometimes it is a barrier. So don't do that if it's going to be a barrier. Don't introduce like an A3 sheet of paper and the format if that's not going to be helpful. Don't introduce the tool, but you can introduce the thinking process that goes behind the tool. And so, and so talk about it that way. Okay, what's your target? What's actually happening? What's the background? Basically going through that same process. So you can teach the thinking without necessarily using a tool or calling it something, if that's going to be a barrier for people.
Love that, Katie. I'll jump in until Keivan. I think he might be coming back. I'm looking at Ken's smile sort of in the background because
me too.
This was the message that Ken was putting across in his session earlier this year, and very aligned to how we think. I think it is you have to work with people to the understanding and the language is really important. There is a quick question that I'm going to jump in with before I let Keivan jump back in.
Please go ahead, Elsa. Just checking.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great.
I'm going to ask. I'm actually going to ask Bob to ask it if he can unmute because it's Bob's question.
Yes, thank you for that. There's actually two questions, but I'll ask the first one first. I think for us on the call, what you're talking about is purpose and creating that, and behaviors is, to me, a no-brainer. But in your studies, what have you found what are some of the key challenges that are getting in leaders' way of actually doing something that is kind of natural?
Right, or intuitive. And, I just was at a large healthcare system client of mine, and, I've been working with them for years. And actually some of their leaders came with me to Japan last October, and they're so passionate about this. And then the big barrier is, this came out loud and clear in a pre-retreat survey we did, and also in the discussion just last week. Leaders are overburdened by too many priorities and so much time and all the things they have to accomplish. They're like, I have so many meetings, I can't get out to round or to go to Gemba. So that's a system issue, right? And that goes back to the executive leadership. How are you going to get really, I know there's a lot of things you got to do, but there's a great quote in the book, a Japanese proverb, if you chase after two hares, you'll catch neither. Right. It's so hard for us to get focused, but that's a leader's role. Set the direction, set the clear priority maybe, and goals. And then that allows people to have more time to run after that hare or to focus on it.
Right.
And, I don't have the answer on that because it's hard for all of us. There's so many things to accomplish, but having that time and feeling overburdened is one huge barrier that I see across the board. And then the second is about, we are rewarded through our careers, through our schooling, to be the person with the answer, to save the day, to give our ideas. And we love to help. And, I've come up with a term called we need to break the telling habit. We're often sharing our ideas because we want to be helpful, but it's actually taking over the thinking and the responsibility for thinking from other people. And so we have to learn to hold back. Then it's not always our role to give the answer, to tell people what to do. And sometimes out of that time pressure too, it's just easier to tell people all our ideas or just go do this. But we're actually one, burdening ourselves with the responsibility for the doing. So it contributes to the sense of we don't have time as leaders to do all these other things. And two, we're not really developing our people or giving them space or opportunities to contribute as well. And so I see those as two of the biggest barriers across the board, both when, before I started my consulting practice and was working in healthcare organizations for a long time, and now for the last 11 years working with, companies of all industries across the world. Those are the two biggest. Feeling overburdened and too many priorities and we don't have time. And then two, we're just in this habit of giving all our ideas and suggestions, and we have to learn to ask more questions and listen.
And then as
Yeah.
a follow-up in your research, because I mean, you're speaking to the choir here, what have you found other companies in your research do to help break that mindset as I don't have time? Did it come from like the C-suite or the CEO level asking their leaders to actually make the time? Or what have you found in your research that for those organizations that broke that bad cycle, if you will, to actually focus on this?
Yeah, so I think there's twofold. Of course, if the senior leaders can help by getting more focused on priorities and creating structures and systems in the organization that create that space and time to say to go to Gemba and do, go to the workplace and do these things. Like I worked with this great senior leader who he made, it took almost a year and a half for this to happen, but he created a standard calendar across our healthcare system that had some meeting-free zones and also days that were the day that it was expected you're going to go out to Gemba. And that helped align meetings and create the space and time. So systems and structures can really help. But even without that, you can, again, this goes back to that, like how in your leader standard work do you create the time and create the space? It's about just say, you yourself saying, okay, and do it small. Like you can't, like, what does better look like for the next month? What does better look like? Better looks like for 15 minutes, 3 times a week, I'm going to go out to the floor and talk to people, or better looks like this. So focus on the word, like, what does a little bit better look like? Because it can be too much of a barrier to be like, we just don't have time. You can create 10, 15 minutes. We all can. And so start there. So start there and experiment and see how that starts to build. But those are the two, one's big systemic things, but you can also have control over the small things that you can do. Yeah. Thanks for the questions.
Agree. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Elsa, for jumping in and saving the day. I've replaced my headset now, as you noticed, that stopped working. So, Katie, if I may reiterate very quickly, you pointed out a couple of very important points. One is creating those systems that drive and influence the right behaviors.
Yeah.
And then also the second one, having the belief in the importance of these items, if that's how I heard it at least. But do please jump in and correct me. Now, in fact, maybe this is a good time to pose the last question I have for you, and that is: so which one is it then? Is it how, in terms of how do we go about creating better culture and better future for ourselves and better leadership in general? Is it that we want leaders who are the embodiment of those good behaviors, and of course good behaviors beget behaviors, and so on and so forth? Or is it the fact that we need leaders who know how to create those systems and structures you just named, you just referred to? In fact, Shingo Institute teaches that systems drive behavior. And Dr. Deming famously said, a bad system beats a good person almost every time. So which one of the two is it that you would primarily put forward as a primary focus for a leader? For them to be the embodiment of the good. So the two, one being, is it drive by being the embodiment of good behavior so your people will follow by your example? Or is it put your focus more on creating the good systems? Or in fact, maybe you say there's no contradiction between the two, you have to do both.
Yeah, I don't believe it's binary. And so I think actually one of our limiting biases or beliefs is that we have to keep doing these either or things. I actually believe it's an and I talk about leadership continuums, and there's a lot of things we need to, it's not that we only want to ask questions as a leader, and not never tell. There's like sometimes telling is right and good, just has a different impact. We just have to know the slide between it. It's not just, oh, I can only be an expert or I can be a coach. No, sometimes your expertise is needed. Sometimes you're there to cultivate the expertise of other people. So I actually do not believe it's a binary choice. And actually, we have to both work towards better and the behaviors that we believe and know are going to align with our purpose and the outcomes we want and the impact we want. So like I say, that leading with intention. So what's the impact and outcome you want? What are the behaviors that are going to align with that, and work towards practicing getting a bit better every day on those things. At the same time, we have to create systems and structures that support those behaviors, not just for ourselves, but in our organizations as well. So systems and structures support the behaviors. And so if you just have the systems and structures and you're not practicing any of the behaviors, then what's the point? And also if you have systems, if you have behaviors, but you don't have the systems and structures that support them, it's going to be a real challenge to keep those up. So I see them as going forward together in partnership to create the personal structures and behaviors and then create the organizational culture as well. So that would be my answer. How about you? What do you think?
Oh, okay. 100% aligned, if I may say so. Why should there be any sort of contradiction? There is a famous debate on YouTube that I can put the link in here between two people we probably all know and respect, Jeff Liker and John Seddon, and it turns into a debate, and it's I think at some sort of Shingo Forum or Lean Forum. Elsa can correct us. It turns into a debate that one is saying it's all about systems and the other one says it's all about people. This is a few years ago now, and then like you say, why should there be any contradiction? Shouldn't it be both? In fact, one without the other is probably not complete, right, Katie?
Yes. Yeah,
okay.
I would agree. I see several nods of Ken and Lacey and Atticus and others. So yes, totally.
And Sean and others. And I think, isn't this exactly what the Shingo Institute teaches us?
Yeah.
Very good. I wonder if anyone in particular about this topic that we just discussed wants to jump in and ask any questions or make any comments in particular about what we just discussed or Katie just discussed before we go to read some of the questions in the chat. And we do have a very sort of a learned audience, if you like. You are preaching to the converts now here.
Yes,
Katie,
of course.
I have to say, yeah.
Well,
and so no, I think we just have a lot of nods, no questions coming in at least. Elsa, do we have any questions in the chat? Oh no, go ahead. Yes, please.
I'll just say something, and it's once again preaching to the choir, the converts that already are here. How powerful it can be as leaders to identify the right question to ask to unlock the potential that someone thinks that they don't have.
Yes.
And I was just having a conversation with someone yesterday, like, well, I need that same exact thing, expert or leader. And I'm like, well, what about both? And the light in their eyes was powerful. They were like, I thought I had to pick.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you know what? Many years ago, I thought I had to pick two because my boss told me I did, an old boss. And I said, I want both. And they said, you're crazy. I said, okay, call me crazy. I want both. So I just wanted to echo what you had said and how we can, as leaders, we can identify the right questions to unlock the self-limiting behaviors or beliefs that we have for ourselves in others or that others have in themselves. So just echoing what you said and how powerful it can be.
Thanks, Lacey. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in Orlando.
It'll be awesome. Yes, I'm excited to see you too.
Thank you, Lacey. Same here. See you soon in Orlando. And Elsa, do we have any questions in the chat? You want to read one of those? So I think we do.
Bob's got a question. Bob's got his hand up.
Oh, Bob, because
first of all, I've had my opportunity to ask questions. So let everybody ask their questions, and if there's no more questions, then come back.
Go. No questions at the moment.
No questions at the moment. I guess, just here again, I'm going to get your book. I'm really curious. I love the lessons from histories from the 80s, from the 70s, etc. So for those leaders at Toyota, how had those legacies that I assume created reflecting in the company today and today's leadership?
Yeah, so good question. I can't really speak totally to that because I am not entrenched in Toyota today. But I have spoken over the last few years at different, especially in the North America, some of the Toyota factories, or not factories, different, spoken with different initiatives, and
Sites,
been
yeah.
following sites,
Yeah.
thank you, and or functions, and also been following the news in Japan with Akio Toyoda and some of the comments he's been making. So I can speak to that, but not with like deep
Okay,
knowledge
that's
about what's
fine.
actually happening. So one of, in the book, Mr. Yoshino reflects that sort of every 20 years, Toyota's had to like retighten the belt on their culture and their leadership culture. Starting off, there's some stories in the book about, in the late 1970s and 80s, really refocusing on sorry, I'm gonna forget, like my brain's going over, when they had won, not the Shingo Award, but I'm so connected to the
The
Shingo
Deming
Award.
Award.
Yeah, was it the Deming Award? Yes. I'm like, was that right? Yes.
The
Yeah,
first
then late
one,
in
yeah.
the 60s, and
Yeah.
Refocus on that, and because they had lost their way, sort of generationally. It speaks to the human nature of entropy, right? Like we kind of lose sight and kind of lose our way. And then back in the Toyota Way 2001 was another way to retighten the belt. And then if you think about right now, it's about 20-ish years later, Akio Toyoda came out, and there's some just in January, February, was talking about how he, in Hansei, in reflection, was looking at Toyota had lost its way and really lost sight of some of its management practices, getting too focused on sales and sales results and outcomes as well. So trying to really get back to what they know is the core, all these principles we're talking about, and beliefs. I also talk, so there's some links in there I can share later, because I'd referenced, actually, no, go back to the Shingo webinar that I did, because I actually highlighted those in that talk, because it had just come out when I did that webinar in February. And I thought it was really powerful, of this concept of how is this today? And then when I was speaking at Toyota North America in the years that the book came out, the reflection from leaders in those sessions was that there were elements of this culture still, but they also felt like there was some losing the way. And so they were inspired by the stories in the book as a way to like refocus on, oh, that's why we did things that way, or that's why we need to do this. So I think it just really speaks to, it always requires intention and attention to stay true to these principles. And it's not necessarily easy. We all can get kind of diffuse in our actions without being purposeful around it. So I didn't fully answer your question, but
no, but you provided great insight in that. And I saw it where I came from before Allstate, and I see that at Medline now is the generation, called generation loosely defined. Every 20 or so years, the environment is changing, leaders are changing, etc. And I like that concept of, you got to tighten your belt, and the leaders have to reflect to see, are we losing our way?
Yes. Yeah.
So no, and it's also good to know, because we all know Toyota is still a really great company, given their products and given the customer satisfaction. I assume their results internally are good too. So that provides, if you will, some insight as to what they did back in the 80s and 70s is still there.
Going back to the roots, going back to the origins, Bob, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. And it's interesting because you end the book, Katie. Now the story you just said, or the talk you just gave us, reminded me that you end the book with Yoshino-san's last experience, which wasn't exactly a big success, but then he reflected, and maybe from the beginning, Katie, correct me, it sounded like the story at least tells you that he kind of had a hunch from the beginning that this is not 100% going to be successful, maybe, or he had some clues. And at the end, he reflects and uses that as a positive learning experience. Do you want to tell us more about that, maybe?
Yeah. So first, show of hands, who here has heard of the Toyota water ski boat?
Not many, I guess.
Not many, right? Well, if you've read the book, you have, but like most of us had never heard of the Toyota Lexus water ski boat, and this was a huge a failure. So a few things about that. I don't believe Mr. Yoshino. I mean, he thought that there were some things going wrong, but he was passionate about this idea. This was his idea. He wanted to make it a success. So he had a lot of concerns on how the process was unfolding, which is, and this was 10 years. And so first, I want to highlight that one of the things Toyota has done effectively is they invest in innovation as well as continuous improvement. So they are doing Kaizen and continuous improvement in their standard operations. And then they're also investing in innovations outside of this. So this is time in the 80s, they were having 80s and 90s, they would have groups that were exploring new ideas. And this is where the Prius came out of it as well. That was a success. What wasn't a success was the water ski boat. And this is where it actually took place. In Mr. Yoshino moved back to the United States, lived in
Florida.
Lived in California for a few years, and then moved out to Orlando where production was taking place, because he saw, one of the frustrations is the American Toyota leaders, they thought it was fine to be away from Gemba and just have phone calls. And he's like, no, like production needs leadership on site to manage this thing. I will move out to Orlando, even though he didn't really love Orlando, to do this. And it still was I'll let you read the story, but I think what's important too is Mr. Yoshino always was very forthright that he had this big business failure. And so he always talked that I had this big business failure. And one of the things that he really valued was Mr. Cho, that at the time, the president of Toyota, who thanked him for trying, was really kind to him after this big business failure. But he never talked about the details. And as we were working on the book, and this is over the course of several years, I started to peel away the onion through my questions. And he even says through your kind questions and curiosity and really the fullness of the story as it comes, this 10-year story, as it comes out in the book. And he would always be kind of, gray when we were talking about this. Like you just see kind of down. And one night, and I just remember this vividly, he all of a sudden had this, like, because he's a very smiley, happy guy normally. He had this, he's like, I see this experience in a new light. Your questions have helped me reflect and reframe this experience. I can see it differently. And I mean, honestly, if creating this book, that was the only outcome and the only thing, and none of you got to read it or learn from it, that would make all of those years and all those hours worthwhile to
Worth it.
Yeah, to make it worth it. So I think it's important too that Hansei can happen at different points in time. And also it can be hard to unburden ourselves from a sense of failure, even if we know it's not fully our fault as well. So I'll let you read that full story. And I'm happy to talk more at another time about that too.
Katie, you want to tell us what was that new light? If you want to just finish that story, that he saw it in a new light, and what was that turned it from negative into a positive? Yeah.
The new light was that he, it wasn't fully his responsibility, and that my questions helped him see the sort of the system issues more broadly and
more
kind of
fundamental.
And the process also of talking about it, it's almost like therapeutic. Like you can unburden yourself from the weight that you've been carrying around for yourself. And so, and I know that over the last 4 years too, people talk about so much how they really value his vulnerability and honesty and sharing those failures. I think that makes him feel even better about going there and doing that. But I think it was just, I helped him reframe that experience of, it was really hard. I mean, he was living away from his family too. And like, it was just, there was a lot of hard things about it that, were really dark days in his life. And so it just gave him a different perspective. And echoing what Lacey said, some of our responsibility is asking open-ended questions